Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Northern Slant Hosts with me, Roger Greer. Today I'm joined by Conor Kelly from University College London Consultation Unit. Conor's Research Assistant and Project Manager on the work on perspectives in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland and has worked on the working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland. He's also a part-time PhD student at Birkbeck College, University of London, and it's great to have him join us today. Conor, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on, and we're on to speak about research which the team's carried out on public attitudes to referendums and Irish unification. But before we look at that work, what's the background to the project and the working group more generally?
Yeah, so the public consultation was run by a working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland. So it's an academic project that is based at the Constitution Unit at University College London, and is chaired by an academic, my boss, Dr. Alan Rennick. But it brings together a team of academics, a dozen academics from across Britain, Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the United States also. And it's looking at how hypothetical referendums and Irish unification would best take place. So it doesn't have a perspective on whether or not unification is a good thing or whether or not a border poll should happen, but it's examining how a referendum would best be designed and conducted if it ever does take place. And the team brings in sort of expertise from history, political science, with a team of lawyers, and it produced a report in May 2021, so a couple of months ago, which basically laid out how unification referendums could take place and the different ways that referendums could be sequenced and configured, and looked at different issues that kind of come up in this debate around, so, you know, the role of the Secretary of State or what the franchise should be in the vote. And it's quite a meaty report. It's well over 200 pages. And part of that report analysed a public consultation that we had run. So it was a survey that we had put out in Northern Ireland. But we weren't really able to go into a lot of detail on it. We had a lot of material available. So a team who are based at the Constitution Unit, not the working group itself, but sort of research assistants like myself, a research volunteer, and Dr. Rennick, put together a sort of supplementary working paper, and it's examining the results of that public consultation in more detail.
Yeah, it's a really interesting report. I was reading it over the weekend, and I mean, what was the background to that report happening? What did it aim to learn, I suppose?
Yeah, so I guess the public consultation really had two aims. One, to inform the work of the working group, to give, you know, people a chance to feed into the working group, you know, because we were speaking with different academics and politicians and civic society leaders, but we thought that this is a project that you know, potentially was really impactful on people's lives down the line. So it'd be really important that ordinary people in Northern Ireland could have a say. So it served that purpose. And then second, it sort of helped us get a sense of, you know, who's interested in this project, what are the people who are interested think about these issues, and, you know, not only what did they think, but did they have anything that we might have missed, you know, over the course of our research that we could then bring into the project. And there were really, you know, fascinating insights from people around, you know, what the franchise should be, you know, what the threshold should be, but also just sort of general hopes and fears that they might have about the referendum. So it was released last summer. So the paper is about a year after the consultation was actually run. Ran for 6 weeks last summer. And 1,300 people, nearly 1,400 people responded. 800 of them were in Northern Ireland, or said they were in Northern Ireland. So, you know, for an exercise of this kind, it's probably the largest sort of qualitative survey that's ever been done on this topic, the largest that I'm aware of anyway. So it had a couple of different purposes, both academic, but also just giving people an opportunity to sort of feed into the project themselves.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. One of the phrases that is earlier on the report that I read was very few people had thought in any detail about the features of any referendum. You know, it's clear that, you know, there are discussions ongoing about what the shape of a potential new Ireland would be if a referendum was successful. But I'm not sure a lot of people are giving thought to the first step in that process, which is how a referendum might be shaped itself. And we can get into the findings in a minute, but I suppose there are sensitivities about speaking about future referendums, particularly for unionists, I would say. But it's important that the shape of that referendum as the first step is right. And what's the power of deliberative discussions like this, and making sure that those sorts of discussions are useful and fruitful and feed into that process?
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into the findings in a bit, as you said, but one of the findings of the consultation is that, there aren't large numbers of people in our survey coalescing around particular ideas or particular thoughts on how certain things to do with the mechanics of the referendum should be run. So that kind of indicates that, there isn't an agreed position across society, even within different communities in Northern Ireland, around how certain things should happen. And that's quite interesting in itself. There's a lot of diversity in opinion. But yeah, I mean, there's different ways of getting people's opinions on these sorts of questions. So like there has been quantitative polling that's been done before around, whether or not people would vote, how people would vote in a border poll if it was held tomorrow, whether or not they want a border poll to take place in the next couple of years. There's been qualitative work done by other academics, citizens' assemblies on other sort of deliberative fora. That sort of try and get people in a room and get them to talk about how they feel about how, a United Ireland might be shaped, or how a referendum would be run, or, different questions are kind of around this subject. But I guess the benefit in our consultation, and where our consultation kind of adds, is that anyone could take part. It was put out on the internet. You didn't need to be invited. You didn't need to have a pollster knock on your door. Everybody who wanted to take part, no matter where you were in the world, could take part. And that was sort of, that for me is one of the benefits, because it allows people to kind of reflect on these, as you say, kind of technical details of the referendum, and not just the core question of, do I want a United Ireland? Sort of, we didn't actually ask people about the shape of a United Ireland. That came up, nevertheless. But we asked people about the mechanics of a referendum. Yeah, it definitely came up. But we asked people about the mechanics of a referendum, which, aren't necessarily what people are chatting about at the kitchen dinner table, or, over a pint in the pub. They're not probably talking about the kind of intricacies of how a referendum would work. And if we are heading towards a referendum, which we might be, it would be good if there was more public reflection on these sort of questions. So hopefully the consultation sort of prompted some people to start thinking about these things.
Yeah, and you said it got responses from a large number of people. What were the main findings of the report then?
Yeah, so I should sort of, before I get into the findings, sort of just point out that the survey was, as I said, self-selected. People could take part if they wanted to take part. And given the nature of this subject, it's not surprising that we had a lot of different skews across who did take part and who didn't take part. So the consultation was sort of 63% filled in by people from a nationalist background, or people who describe themselves as nationalist, which obviously isn't reflective of the demographics of Northern Ireland. There are also skews around more men taking part than women. People with higher education degrees tended to take part more than those without. So it isn't a representative sample. So like the figures and the sort of the findings that I'm going to go through are reflective of the people who took part in the consultation and the way that we've analysed it. It's not necessarily reflective of views in wider society, but there's two broad sets of findings. So the first are all around hopes and fears for United Ireland, and the different hopes and fears that were shared with us around a referendum process. I should say, actually, not a United Ireland, the referendum. And the second set of findings are around the sort of mechanics and people's views on different aspects of the process. So in terms of hopes and fears, that was the first set of questions. When you'd hear talk about a referendum, what are your hopes and fears? And what was really interesting to read was that there were different hopes and different fears for nationalists and unionists, and those who describe themselves as neither. It wasn't just that nationalists had a lot of hopes and unionists had a lot of fears. Hopes and fears exist all across society. So one of the most common fears, I'll leave with the fears, was that the referendum would be divisive. So 10% of nationalists said that the referendum might be divisive. 23% of unionists thought that, so it's obviously quite a fear within unionism. And 29% of those who identify as neither thought that the referendum might be divisive. Another fear that people had was that it could spark a return to violence. So 19% of nationalists thought it might lead to a return to violence. 31% of unionists thought it might lead to a return to violence. And 35% of neithers feared that there would be a return to violence. So that's another sort of really powerful fear that came across in different communities in different ways. And then there were all sorts of different sort of fears that came up across the survey around whether or not the losing side would accept the result, people talking about the need for cross-community engagement before and after a referendum. Unionists talking about the need for them to be protected in a united Ireland if it ever comes about. And different nationalists and neithers maybe talking about the role of different governments, the British government or the Irish government, and wanting the British government and the Irish government to lead this process in as fair a way as possible. So those are the fears. And there were lots of then hopes across society as well. So a lot of nationalists, a quarter of nationalists actually said that their hope would be that there would be better community cohesion in a united Ireland. If United Ireland came about, that the different communities in Northern Ireland would get on better. A small number of unionists actually brought that up as well, and 13% of neithers. And then there were other hopes around, potential economic boosts for Northern Ireland if it were to join a united Ireland. The prospect of rejoining the EU was another hope that existed across society, and that was brought up by neithers in particular, but also by nationalists. So what you see is that hopes aren't confined to nationalists and fears aren't confined to unionists. People have lots of different hopes and fears about what this process might lead to, both about a referendum, but also about a united Ireland. We also asked, sort of aligned to that question, if you have hopes and fears, what would you want more information on? What issues do you feel like you need more information on before you were ever to vote in something like this? So a whole load of issues came up, raised by different communities in response to that question as well. So one of the big issues, I think the biggest issue that came across all three communities was more information on healthcare and how healthcare would be organised in a united Ireland. So 45% of nationalists and neithers brought up healthcare, but also 25% of unionists wanting more information about how the NHS would or wouldn't transfer to United Ireland. But people also asked for information on sort of finance and economics of unification, what the constitutional arrangements would be. Would Northern Ireland continue as a devolved entity within the new state? But also just everyday matters of what would be the pension arrangements, what would be the educational system, what protections would be there for minorities within this new state. So yeah, in addition to the sort of broad hopes and fears, there's lots of sort of the sort of nitty gritty of everyday life and politics that people want information on. Yeah.
There's one quote which I saw which made me laugh. It didn't make me laugh, but it made me give me a wry smile. One person said, I fear that some parties will use the referendum campaign to stoke fear, division and sectarianism in order to influence the electorate. And I thought, surely that's just every election in Northern Ireland, regardless if it's a referendum or not. And I suppose it sort of, touching that wider concern, as you say, and one of the things that I went into the report thinking I might see, but I didn't as much, and maybe you'll correct me, was the indication of unionism, unionists who want a referendum to put the question to bed. I saw people saying, there'll be no referendum at all, don't open Pandora's box, or unionists saying, I see this as an attack on British people or people who identify as British in Northern Ireland. But it seemed like there was a lack of unionism wanting to tackle that question head on, which I sort of saw as a surprising feature of the report.
Yeah, so that's a point I haven't actually mentioned. I'm throwing out percentages and the findings of the report, but if you actually read the report, we were very careful and we thought it was very important to take what people actually said and put it on the page, so not to just interpret all the results, but to also make sure that the people who took part's words were on the page and people could read their actual views. So as you know, having gone through the report, most of the report is really just quotes from people and different excerpts of what they had said to us about these different issues. So the report is full of really rich information from people who took part from all different perspectives on what they think, and it's in their own language. We haven't edited it at all. And yeah, I mean, it's an important point that the unionists who took part, for the most part, in the consultation said they didn't want a referendum to happen. Yeah. So, that was pretty clear in the vast majority of unionist responses. They thought it would be divisive. They thought it was unwarranted, that there isn't anywhere near a majority for this to take place. Some people will probably get to the mechanics results later, but some people said there should be an increased threshold, even if there is 50% support. But also, you know, unionists were willing to take part in the consultation and do want information about this process. So just because someone is opposed to United Ireland or opposed to a referendum taking place doesn't mean that if a referendum is to take place, that doesn't mean that they don't want answers to questions. So lots of unionists did give really interesting insight into the sort of questions that they have, the guarantees that they would want, the issues that they would want information on. So, you know, there's always sort of this debate about, you know, unionist engagement in this conversation, but this is me speaking personally. I find that, you know, different people will engage on the terms that they feel comfortable with. So obviously, not as many unionists wanted to engage in this sort of exercise than nationalists. That's kind of obvious, but you know, there are unionists who are willing to take part in conversations if they're inclusive and if they aren't sort of predetermining a United Ireland or presuming that there's going to be a United Ireland. Like the working group project was very clear on that. You know, we're not advocating for United Ireland or for a referendum, and it's on that basis that unionists took part in the conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I think as unionists, or as a unit, I find that strategy we, you know, don't speak about this thing in case it happens. And you know, there were more nationalists take part than unionists, but it was really interesting to see the perspectives of unionism in there, because some of them were surprising. I mean, looking at the report, there was some perspectives from other referenda. So, you know, people said, you know, this will be a highly contentious issue, and it'll be important that there's clear transparency on, you know, a range of issues. And people described, you know, it should ensure that there's no Brexit lies, and allowing people to, you know, see the breakdown of what they would either have or lose, and, you know, whatever the result might be. And that's quite hard, you know, to do. But so what were the main findings from? What have we learned from other referenda that we can put to use? Should a referendum happen here?
Yeah, so people brought up this is something that we looked at sort of later on in our sort of coding and going through the analysis. In terms of our analysis of the results, but it was really interesting to see that quite a number of people from all different communities brought up previous sort of constitutional referendums that had taken place in Britain and Ireland. So one of the main findings, which is probably not surprising to anyone, is don't follow Brexit. You know, that came across all different communities. You know, it's particularly neithers. Don't follow the Brexit sort of template. And one of the issues that kept coming up when people talked about Brexit was the need for donor transparency and the need for just greater transparency of like who's running campaigns, who's financing campaigns, where's the money coming from. And yeah, as I said, all different communities brought that up in different ways, but they brought up sort of making sure that if there's a referendum, that it doesn't follow sort of some of the mistakes that maybe the Brexit process involved around, you know, nefarious groups financing different campaigns. Yeah. People also brought up the 2014 Scottish referendum again in different ways. Lots of nationalists brought up the Scottish referendum and talked about votes at 16 and wanting people to be able to vote from 16 on. Other people brought up Good Friday Agreement referendum, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement referendum in '98, and I think a couple of people mentioned the fact that at that time a booklet was produced on what the agreement was and sent to every house in Northern Ireland. So, you know, something like that around what, you know, the shape of United Ireland or what the plan for agreeing United Ireland was, if that were sent to homes before the referendum, that might be something that they would find really useful. The other thing that came up, which isn't directly linked to specific referendums, but is citizens' assemblies. Lots of nationalists brought up citizens' assemblies, which have become increasingly part of the Republic's referendum process. Yep. So people probably know there were citizens' assemblies around things like abortion and gay marriage. So people brought up citizens' assemblies, but particularly nationalists. So I think something 24% of nationalists brought up citizens' assemblies, and it's actually something we say in the report that in a relatively short pace of time, it seems that nationalists are advocating for citizens' assemblies where unionists aren't. And the point of citizens' assemblies is sort of to bring people together. So we just sort of put a note of caution in there that, you know, citizens' assemblies shouldn't be associated with arguments one way or the other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, clearly people are interested in sort of lessons of the past, be they from Brexit or be they from referendums in the South or even the last sort of constitutional referendum in Northern Ireland on the Good Friday Agreement. So yeah, that was a particularly interesting sort of part of the survey.
Certainly, yeah. And there was you mentioned the age limit for voting in any referendum, and the desire to have 16 and 17-year-olds take part, as in the Scottish referendum. I found that quite interesting. I also thought, I mean, and I agree as well, whether excuse one way or the other. But the other thing I found really interesting was the threshold argument, and how different groups viewed the threshold and whether it should be 50% plus one. And you know, I think from reading it, it seemed that most people were content that 50% plus one was legitimate, but if it was 50% plus one, that would not be the ideal result.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and it's a, you know, some people would say it's a difficult circle to square.
Yeah.
So we actually had in the second half of the survey, we talked about all different sort of mechanics of the vote. So not people's hopes and fears, but more like intricate details of the referendum. And we brought up things like the role of the Secretary of State, the franchise, you know, how referendums should be kind of configured, how plans for United Ireland should be worked out. One thing we actually didn't mention is thresholds. We didn't bring it up. And the working group report was quite clear that, you know, the threshold as it is now is 50% plus one, and that's in the Good Friday Agreement. It's the only sort of honest reading of the Good Friday Agreement you could possibly have, is that it's 50% plus one. You know, it's how referendums in the Republic are determined. And really, if you're talking about like a binary sovereignty question, if you were to have a super majority one way or the other, then you're automatically giving a sort of advantage to one side.
Yeah.
But people have very sort of genuine views around this, and fear that, you know, if it was 50% plus one and it was a fine margin, that it would lead to instability or to even violence. And you know, we should take those sort of concerns quite seriously. So even though we didn't bring it up, I think like 13% of nationalists, I've got the figures here, and 10% of unionists brought it up, and 12% of the neithers. And people brought it up in different ways, obviously. So nationalists were much more likely to say, no, it should be 50% plus one. And unionists, but also some neithers were saying that, no, there should be a supermajority somewhere between 60 and 75%. I don't quite remember, did people say, you know, 50% plus one is fair, but it should be 60 to prevent instability? But I suspect that's where people are coming from. It's not that people don't realize that, you know, majority rules is how politics is normally done. It's that they fear that if, you know, Northern Ireland were put through that sort of binary process, it would lead to instability or violence. But, you know, I think it's important that we air those views and that they're in the public consultation because they were brought up with us. But, you know, I'm not a member of the working group, but, you know, the working group was pretty clear that, you know, unless the Good Friday Agreement was renegotiated, the default at the moment for a voter poll is 50% plus one. And that doesn't mean that can't change, but it, you know, again, speaking personally, I find it quite difficult to see how you would get the sort of the suitable level of consensus to change the threshold, to change the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, in order to do that. So yeah, I mean, it's something people are talking about, and the fact that it was brought up sort of unprompted, I think, is something that people should pay attention to. But yeah, I mean, nationalists are equally adamant that it shouldn't change, as unionists and some neithers are that it should change.
Yeah, it was a really interesting part of it. I look at the quote. There's a quote in the report that said, "I don't need any questions answered. I feel that I know enough about the entire situation that I would be comfortable voting." And I think actually, isn't that a challenge as well? That as much as we want to shape referenda, you know, ahead of time, or you know, influence the way that the threshold might be, or even just the way it's developed and the questions that are in it, and even just, you know, even elections or the economy or the health service or society in general, and we try to influence them in the best possible way. You know, factors outside our control, you know, socioeconomic, historical, and probably most importantly political, mean that you know, events will dictate how these things play out. And you look at the Brexit debate, you look at the Indie referendum and elections more generally, and you see it isn't always an ideal situation, or it isn't always done as everyone wants. And I suppose, how, you know, what can we do to impact this now? You know, how can we ensure that any referenda, you know, whatever they're for in the future, how can we use things like, you know, these processes to shape that into a fair process as far as possible? What can these things do?
Well, that's a heavy question.
Very heavy question.
That
It's
I'll
when's the
probably give
yeah.
a long answer to, but yeah, I mean, in the consultation, lots of people did say that I don't need, especially in response to that question about what information do you need. Lots of people said no, I've made up my mind, and I think lots of people who probably did say that they want information have their mind made up. You know, unionists are for the union, and nationalists are for a united Ireland. I mean, that is their overarching constitutional preference. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, if this is going to happen, that nationalists don't want, there are questions around the NHS answered about what healthcare provision would be in the United Ireland that they want. And equally that unionists, fully intent on voting against, wouldn't want to know what the plans were in United Ireland, and would their Britishness be protected, but also would their pensions carry over, and what would the educational arrangements for their children be. Like, just because someone has a sort of clearly defined constitutional preference doesn't mean that they don't want answers to these questions. And same with neithers. Neithers, people who are responding and saying that they're neither unionist nor nationalist, one would have thought that their sort of votes would be swayed by questions like this, or at least that it would be a big factor in considering whether or not to vote for unity. This sort of gets to the heart of a kind of tension, I guess, that's in the whole process, and that the working group identified. And it's really between the desire for a sort of informed choice, that people go to the ballot box knowing what they're voting for and what's going to happen if they vote yes, and then the desire for a sort of consensual process where everybody agrees on what will happen after unity, what a united Ireland would look like. And because unionists, for very understandable reasons, are not inclined to take part in a conversation about how to make a united Ireland work before they've lost the referendum, there is that tension, because sure, you can scope out what a united Ireland would look like, but you're probably only going to get the input of nationalists, or you're not going to get a lot of engagement from unionism. You're certainly not going to get engagement from sort of unionism's political representatives. And there are a couple of different ways that referendums could be configured and sequenced, and there's no way of getting around that tension entirely. But there's a couple of different ways that the working group identifies. So there's like 3 ways that the referendums could be configured. One is you work out everything beforehand. You work out as much as possible with as much engagement as you can. You give rights and protections and all the rest of it to people, even if they don't want to take part in the conversation. Then you have the vote. And then there's another sort of type of referendum where you could have, where instead of having all the details worked out, you have a sort of process plan, and you say, like, if the referendum is yes, this is how the details will work out. And the idea is that, the losing side will then come to the table, having settled the sort of core issue, and then work out, the arrangements for a united Ireland. And that can be done in a couple of different ways. It could be done, that second part could happen after United Ireland has happened, or it could happen while the Northern Ireland is still part of the Union. There could be a couple of years where, okay, we're going to United Ireland now, we need a sort of constitutional convention to work all this out. But it is an inherent tension. Nationalists want to have this conversation, and they want to flesh this out before a referendum happens, and unionists, are naturally inclined not to take part in a conversation like that. Not least because a lot of them don't think we're heading towards a united Ireland, and they think there are more important things and less divisive things to talk about. But that's just the nature of this conversation. We don't know if we're heading towards a united Ireland. We don't know if we're heading towards a border poll. We don't have a crystal ball. Like, things like Brexit, in addition to kind of maybe showing us things that we shouldn't do and the ways that referendums shouldn't be organized, they also sort of show that so much of this is unpredictable, and we don't know how things are going to develop. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens in the next couple of years, and how, if a referendum's held, how the Irish and British governments propose we work out all these issues.
Yeah, and whether or not people want to engage with the discussion, I would suggest that very much go and engage with the paper and the research, because it was really, really, really interesting. And we were speaking before, I was just saying that I'd read Deborah Matheson's book on Beyond the Red Wall, and it looked at the same thing, people's perspectives from the north of England predominantly, about how the Red Wall was won by the Tories in the general election. It's interesting to see people's actual perspectives, unedited perspectives on why they did one thing other than the other. And this is a similar thing. It's really interesting to see why people think one way other than the other on this one of the biggest issues that Northern Ireland could potentially face. So yeah, I suggest everyone go and read it. It's really, really interesting, and we will put a link in the write-up so that people can click through. But Conor, thank you very much for speaking with me today. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Very much. Cheers.